Hello everybody, it's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about how countries fund their own development. So as I think everybody in this room is going to be well aware, global aid budgets are being cut down 23% in 2025, and I don't think it's going to stop there. Now, foreign aid it's a controversial topic. There are some people who think that aid does more harm than good, but I think the evidence shows that aid does more good than harm, so I think these cuts are bad news. But there is one thing that I think aid critics and aid supporters can agree on, and that is that the development goals that we all want to see achieved are only going to be achieved when countries can fund them from their own resources. So here is a map of how much progress countries have made towards the Sustainable Development Goals. It's produced by the UN. The darker countries have made more progress and they have achieved more goals, and the paler countries have a further way to go. Now, like pretty much every map that shows something to do with development, this map looks a lot like a map of how rich countries are. Here is a map of how rich countries are. It shows who are the low-income countries, the lower middle-income countries, the upper middle-income countries, and those figures you can see there show how much these countries spend on average per person per year on the social sectors, health and education. So a low-income country only has $15 per year per person to spend on these things. The upper middle-income countries average $340. And this is why these maps all look the same, because delivering development is expensive. So if you take a country like Nigeria, Nigeria has 240 million people in it. So if it got up towards the upper middle-income average of $340 per year, that would be $82 billion a year. In 2023, Nigeria received $3.5 billion in aid. So that's why everybody understands that it isn't aid that's going to pay for development. Now, I'm not here to try and persuade you that the sort of investments that Norfund makes are a perfect substitute for aid. I think everybody agrees that grant aid can do things that investments in private businesses cannot. But I am here to talk about how these investments are another way of financing development. So, if you want more tax, a very obvious thing to do is to try and tax rich people. That's a good idea. And this is a map of how progressive fiscal systems are in different countries. And you can see that the richer countries tend to have more progressive fiscal systems. This map is based on comparing the incomes of the top 10% of the country and the bottom 50% of the country before and after taxation. You might actually notice that Norway is a little bit of an outlier here. Amongst the high-income countries, your tax system is relatively less progressive, and I understand that's because your incomes are more equal to begin with. So why don't low-income countries have more progressive tax systems? The answer isn't because they are more equal to begin with. Inequality tends to be higher in lower income countries. The answer has to do with how large the informal sector is. Here is a map of the share of the informal sector in GDP in different countries. So an informal business is one that does not comply with the relevant laws and regulations. The workers don't have the rights and benefits that they should have, and the businesses are not registered with the tax authority. So it is quite hard to tax what you cannot see. This is a map of how much tax countries manage to extract from their economies as a share of GDP. Now, there's a lot going on that explains why different countries set different tax levels, but it's not hard to understand why those two maps also look very similar, because you can't tax the economic activity that your tax authorities are unaware of. So how much you can tax has a lot to do with what you tax, what taxes you rely on. This map shows what taxes, sorry, not a map, this figure shows what taxes different countries at different income levels rely on. And I think the most important thing here is that as countries get richer, they rely more on personal income taxes. So that's not just salaries, it's also things like dividend income and investment income. If you want to take money from the rich and give to the poor, that's how you do it. If you've got a small formal sector, not many tax-paying firms, you can't get all the tax you need out of them. What you have to do instead is you have to tax consumption, you tax imports, you try and extract revenues from the agricultural sector with marketing boards and so forth, and all those things tend to hit low-income households worse, and that's why it's harder to be progressive. And you might notice that the amount of tax that countries take out of corporations and profit tax, that's this bar here, doesn't change a great deal as countries get richer. And I think that's because if you have a small formal sector with not many formal tax-paying firms in it, you're very reliant on it and you tax it quite heavily. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but as a rule, high-income countries tend to get their corporate tax by applying a relatively low rate to a wide base, and the poorer countries tend to apply a high rate to a narrower base. And that makes it hard, if you're in the formal sector, that makes it harder to compete against businesses that aren't paying those taxes, and it makes it harder for those formal sector businesses to grow, so you get a bit of a vicious circle going on. So if you're in this situation where you have a small formal sector and you're not getting as much tax out of it as you want, what do? Well, the solution is generally not to try and crack down on informal sector businesses and force them to formalize. There are some sensible things that you can do to increase the benefits of formalization and reduce the burden, but many small businesses would collapse if they were forced to pay taxes and do all the things with their workers that they're supposed to be doing. So I think, and you could argue, if you're feeling very brutal, this is painful, necessary medicine, but I don't think that's the right way to approach things. I think a better way to approach things is to help more firms enter in the formal sector and help more firms in the formal sector grow, and that, of course, is where Norfund and other DFIs come in, because DFIs invest in businesses that are paying tax in countries, in countries where most businesses are not paying tax, and we widen the tax base and we help countries change what they are able to tax. So this is what we want to see going on. We want to see more businesses that look a bit like this appearing, and the way that countries tax changes. The job of DFIs is not to somehow persuade firms to pay more tax. Tax policy is a sovereign decision. We just want the businesses that we invest in to obey the law. There are other parts of the development corporation world that can help countries with their tax capacity and their tax policy design, and that can be a great use of grant aid. Okay, so look, to sum up, we all know the picture is changing. We're going to see more development cooperation in the form of investment and less in the form of grant aid. But really, only taxation is going to pay for development in the long run. The investments that Norfund and other DFIs make, they grow the tax base, they grow the economy, and that's great, but they also change what countries are able to tax, and that puts them in a better position to implement a progressive tax system, which is what's needed to achieve sustainable development goals. That's everything from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paddy. Growing the formal sector and providing taxes is so essential, but it's of course easier said than done, and definitely not without its challenges. So now I'm pleased to welcome a panel to discuss more of these complexities. Anna Cecilie Kaltenborn, Secretary General in Norwegian Church Aid, and my colleague, William Nyaoke, Norfund's Regional Director in East Africa. And the discussion will be moderated by Kristian Sbertoli, Director of Public Relations at Norfund. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Reem, and thank you, Paddy. So, on Cecilie, Paddy just argued that the major cuts of development aids for the past years is putting taxation higher up on the agenda. Is that a perspective that you in Norwegian Church Aid shares?
Absolutely. I think a lot has been said today that it makes a lot of sense, and it's very concerning with the cut in the development aid, of course. But I think regardless of this, tax revenue and getting the snowball turning, as we say in Norway, so that we can get locally produced welfare has really moved up on the agenda. And I do believe that tax is really the only exit strategy from aid. So if we want to go there, and aid was never meant to be the solution, I think we need to have this conversation.
Right. So we need taxation, but Paddy just argued that in economies with a very low part of the economy in the formal sector, it's very hard to have progressive taxation. And then you are left with taxes that hurt the poor, and that can be quite unpopular. Take a look at this.
Yeah, and they're saying that they want the bill that is being debated in Parliament to be rejected in its entirety. They disagree with many of the clauses there. On Tuesday, the government announced that it was announced concessions on a number of the controversial clauses, including 16% value-added tax on bread, motor vehicle levies, and other taxes. But they say that is not enough.
So, William, this is Kenya 2 years ago. Can you explain to us what happened?
Look, this is a classic example of what happens when the government is pressured to increase taxes to, go for bread and sanitary pads and things that people use on a daily basis. And back to the progressive tax, it's very difficult in a country like Kenya to tax the richest because there are not many rich people there. So you have to widen the tax base and go for the basic goods, and you end up with what exactly happened in Kenya that led to some deaths from these riots.
So do you see any solutions? Where do you go from here?
Absolutely. I mean, look, the solutions have been told before. We need to create more businesses that can pay more taxes. And that's why Norfund does what it does, because the more formalized businesses you invest in, the larger they grow. You build an ecosystem of tax-paying entities that then you can tax and increase the ability to collect locally and build your social networks to serve your people.
But people don't trust the government in Kenya. What do you do?
Look, I think that has a history, right? So it's not that we don't pay taxes. We actually pay a lot of taxes, right? But our tax and expenditure do not rhyme. So, for instance, there's something in Africa called black tax. I don't know whether you guys are aware of it. So people actually pay for school fees for their children, their cousins' children, and all every relative you have. If you're the only one earning in the family, you have to pay school fees for everyone, and that goes to healthcare. We build our own roads because roads are very bad. So people have to contribute in neighborhoods to build roads. That doesn't happen in Norway, right? So because of that, there's distrust because what we pay is actually not being used to serve us. Then you realize it's actually going into a bottomless pit, and you don't trust that if you pay more taxes to the government, that you'll get services for it. So we pay the government, but then we still spend on things that the government should be providing for us. Yeah.
So there's a basic lack of trust on Cecilie, where you work in these societies as well, together with local faith-based organizations, other civil society. What do you do with this?
Well, I think we are able to do a lot. Norwegian Church Aid has been around for 80 years next year. And I think we do have an important role to play here. And I'd like to mention one example, because I think many people know that Norwegian Church Aid has worked for justice, also for tax justice and debt justice. But in Tanzania, we had one very important win. Of course, the win was great for the population, but we were a part of it. 3 years ago, Tanzania passed a law on luxury goods, on tobacco, sugar, alcohol. They called it a tax on sin. It's great. I think that when this tax was passed, it was because also we, who usually talk about tax justice, went from talking about tax justice to talking about what is it we need to finance with this tax, given the lack of motivation, right? And so for 5 years before this law was passed, we worked with religious leaders in Tanzania, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, who are also the people with the greatest level of trust in Africa and definitely in Tanzania. And the point was, we need to get universal health care for the 12 million poorest people of a population of 72 million who cannot access health care. And now this tax has been passed 3 years ago, and just during these past 3 years, the tax level in Tanzania has risen by 2%, from 23 to 25%, which is not nothing.
Right.
And so I think this is both a case that shows it's possible, and it should be an inspiration to what maybe could be done other places, and shows also that civil sector has a role.
Great. Yeah. So because that's what it's all about, right? It's about taxes that should finance basic welfare. And we talk about, like we say, who wants to pay taxes? We often assume that companies don't want to pay more taxes than they have to by law. But then we also see companies in our portfolio that are directly funding education and health in their communities outside of taxation. Is that some kind of a taxation?
I mean, absolutely. It's taxation, because if you look at companies that we invest in, for instance, Kagera in Tanzania, they run a hospital from their own resources. It's an 80-bed hospital that has a maternity wing and all these things. It's actually the only hospital in that area. They also run a school from primary to secondary school. And these are resources from the company that they would have otherwise used for their shareholders' dividends, but they have to do that because they need the social license to operate in their neighborhood. Because otherwise, if they're the only pillar in that area and people don't have access to these things, then they don't have a good standing in the community. So they have to take part of their profit to provide for social services that the government should be providing from taxes. So they pay their tax as usual, but then they have to spend part of their resources to run essential services that otherwise the government should be providing. And that, from my perspective, is actually additional taxation that they have to do. And that happens across many companies that we've invested in.
So we're stepping in to get the kind of a license to operate.
Yeah, I mean, they call it corporate social responsibility. Yeah. I think it's just another way of taxing, right?
Interesting. And Cecilie, Paddy just argued also that you say it's a problem that too many people are in the informal sector, but it's easier to grow the formal sector than to force the informal sector into the formal sector. Is that a perspective you agree with, or?
Well, we definitely need to do both, right? And I understand the argument about it's easier to grow formal sector and impossible to force an informal sector, which is about 80% of jobs in many African countries. So, I mean, it's an incredibly important thing to do, and it's incredibly difficult. I think basically, in order to formalize, there has to be some good news, right? There has to be some incentive for individuals and for businesses. So, one place to start is to start looking concretely on what are we talking about when we talk about businesses. Are we talking about small-scale farmers, shop owners, hairdressers, security guards, transport chauffeurs? This sector, also in Norway, if you go 20 years back, was very much in the informal sector. What can you do to formalize? Yeah. Well, I think you have to give some kind of incentive to make it worth their while, and then you can really change a lot. The other end, of course, is to start with businesses that sell to government. Public procurement, that's an incredibly strong tool in any country. That's a completely different segment of businesses, right?
Yeah. And so that's building kind of this ecosystem that you were talking about, William. And you're managing many of our investments in this region. Do you see this happening?
Absolutely. So the way we look at it is we invest in companies for growth. And as these companies grow larger, there's an ecosystem that they operate in. They're suppliers of our companies, they're companies they buy from. And there's actually an expectation. I mean, our companies are tax compliant. And for them to buy from a chauffeur company or a security company, that security company has to have tax compliance. And that is how you expand your tax base, by focusing on some leaders or some good examples within the ecosystem. And as they build the ecosystem around them, then you have more companies coming to the fold. So that, from our perspective, you build winners, and the winners build an ecosystem around them.
Right. So we're building an ecosystem through investments. We're working with civil society to push for tax reforms, to build a trust, and together that could contribute to what we all want, which is that these countries would have enough tax income and the possibility to fund their own welfare.
Yeah. And they spend the money properly.
Yes. Thank you very much.